Part 1, Under a False Name. If you'd asked me last month, I'd have told you my life was about as steady as they come. I was Ben Marshall, a well-known divorce attorney in Los Angeles, with high-end clients and a reputation for winning. By day, I dealt with clients and legal loopholes, and by night, I was just another overworked attorney blowing off steam. But then one Thursday night, looking for a break from the same old routine, I ended up at a jazz club tucked away in a back alley in West Hollywood. The kind of place where the lights were dim, and the jazz was loud enough to make you forget your troubles. I ordered my usual scotch, trying to settle into the moment, when I noticed her across the room. She was leaning against the bar, focused on the musicians, a small, amused smile on her lips like she had her own secret joke. She had dark hair that fell just below her shoulders, a black leather jacket, and an easy way about her that made her look like she was waiting for something interesting to happen. I don't know what came over me, but I walked over and introduced myself. Ben Marshall, I said, extending a hand. Let me guess, you're here for the live band? She looked at my hand, then back up at me with an amused smirk. Kate. And yeah, let's go with that. Just Kate? Keeping things mysterious? I teased, noticing she wasn't like anyone I'd usually meet in places like this. Maybe I'm just cautious, she said, raising an eyebrow. You never know what kind of people you'll meet in a place like this. I laughed. I can relate. This isn't my usual scene either. Yeah, I can tell, she replied, eyeing my suit. What brings you to a place like this, Mr. Marshall? Maybe I'm here to meet someone interesting, I replied, feeling the charge in the air. It had been a long time since a conversation had felt this electric. For the next hour, we talked, laughed, and made up stories about the people around us. Kate was witty, sharp, and just guarded enough to keep me on my toes. We didn't dive into any heavy details, no mention of work or family. It was just banter, like a game of mental chess, where each move was meant to outsmart the other. So, what's the most scandalous case you've ever handled? She asked, swirling the wine in her glass. Let's just say, Hollywood divorces come with more drama than the movies, I replied. But I don't think anything's going to beat tonight. Oh? She raised her eyebrow, a hint of a smirk on her lips. I'll take that as a compliment. Take it however you want, I said, unable to hide a grin. What about you? Anyone's life you've ruined recently? Only my own, she replied with a wink. But I like to keep things interesting. The night ended before I was ready for it to, and when she slipped her number into my pocket, I felt that old thrill, the kind that made me feel like I was out on a limb again. As I watched her disappear into the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had just taken a turn, one I hadn't planned for. I told myself it was harmless, just a night out with a stranger who made me laugh. But the truth was, I already knew I'd see her again. Part 2, the beginning of the affair. Kate and I fell into a rhythm almost immediately, like we'd been circling each other for years without knowing it. We started meeting up regularly, careful to keep things low-key, quiet spots in the city, out-of-the-way bars, anonymous corners of coffee shops. And each time, it felt like stepping into a parallel universe where the rules of my life didn't exist. With her, there was no need for masks, no expectations. Just freedom. One night, she called me out of the blue. There's a dive bar in Silver Lake that's too dark to see your hand in front of your face, she said, a hint of laughter in her voice. Meet me there in an hour. I grinned at the phone. You always this demanding? Just be there, she replied, and then she hung up. I found her waiting in the far back of the bar, leaning over an old jukebox, studying the music selection as though it were a matter of life and death. She wore dark jeans and a leather jacket, her hair tucked back, making her look more mischievous, more dangerous. Is this your go-to spot? I asked, slipping up beside her. She glanced at me, her lips curving into that easy smile. Let's just say I come here when I don't want to be found. We found a table in the corner, the dim light barely illuminating her face. The whole place had an air of secrecy, and it only fueled the thrill I felt every time I looked at her. As we talked, her hand slid across the table to rest on mine, her fingers tracing slow circles on my skin, sending a shiver up my spine. It was a simple touch, but there was something magnetic about it, something that made me lean in closer, wanting more. Later that night, as we slipped out of the bar, she paused in the alleyway, glancing over her shoulder with a teasing smile. "What are you staring at, Mr. Marshall?" "Just wondering if you're as trouble as you look," I replied, stepping closer, my pulse pounding. She leaned back against the wall, the dim streetlight casting shadows on her face, her eyes flashing with a spark I couldn't resist. "Maybe you should find out," she whispered. I leaned down, my hand sliding up her waist, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath my fingertips. She pulled me in, her lips meeting mine, soft and tentative at first, then deeper, more intense. I felt the heat of her body against mine, and the world seemed to blur around us. Her hands moved up my back, nails grazing my skin as her mouth parted, inviting me closer. I traced my hand along her thigh, feeling the soft denim, then slipping to the inside, brushing against her skin. She drew in a sharp breath, her body tensing, pressing closer to me, her fingers gripping my shoulders. The way her skin responded under my touch, the way she sighed against my lips, it felt electric, like a spark I couldn't control. We broke apart only when we heard a car pass by, headlights sweeping over us. She laughed, breathless, her eyes wild. "I'd say this is definitely not legal in public," she whispered, her hand still on my chest, as if she needed to hold me there for just a second longer. "Then we should probably continue somewhere a bit more private," I murmured, my hand still tracing her thigh, feeling her shiver beneath my touch. Each rendezvous with Kate became a secret world of its own, a world separate from everything else. There was the night we met on a rooftop downtown, the lights of LA spread out below us, our laughter echoing off the empty walls. Or the time she called me at 2 a.m., just to meet up at a quiet cafe that was almost empty, where we stayed until dawn, drinking bad coffee and sharing bits of ourselves, but never too much. It was the thrill, the electricity of her touch, her voice, that kept pulling me back. And each time, we danced around the edges of a boundary neither of us wanted to define, creating a story that was written only for the two of us. But even then, I could feel a shadow lurking in the back of my mind, a quiet warning that this was only temporary, that secrets had a way of coming to light. But with her, I could ignore it, at least for a little while longer. Each time I was with Kate, it felt like I was shedding an entire layer of myself, the careful, controlled version I showed to the world. With her, I could let that version slip away, and I craved it in a way that felt dangerous. Our meetings became as regular as they were unpredictable, fueled by late-night texts, cryptic messages, and impulsive rendezvous. One night, she texted me just after 10. "Up for an adventure?" was all it said, and half an hour later, I found myself standing in front of a tiny, hidden speakeasy in Venice Beach, the kind of place that didn't show up on any map. I slipped inside, and there she was, sitting at the far end of the bar with a drink in hand, looking every bit the part of someone who'd been there for hours, waiting for me. She glanced over, her lips curving into a mischievous smile as I approached. "You weren't kidding about adventure," I said, sliding into the seat next to her. "Who wants an ordinary night?" she replied, shrugging one shoulder as if daring me to challenge her. Her gaze lingered on me, and I felt the familiar electricity, the charge in the air that always seemed to intensify in her presence. We stayed there for a while, talking, laughing, her hand occasionally brushing against mine as she leaned in close to tell me some private joke. But it didn't take long before the space between us felt like too much. As if reading my mind, she grabbed my hand, leading me to a shadowed corner booth. I barely had a chance to catch my breath before she leaned in, her lips brushing mine, her hand slipping up to rest on the back of my neck. This time, there was no holding back. My hand slid down her waist, pulling her closer, feeling the heat of her body against mine. Her fingers moved to my collar, tracing the line of my shirt before slipping beneath it, her touch sending shivers down my spine. She tilted her head, deepening the kiss, her hands roaming down my back, nails scraping lightly against my skin. I could feel the way she pressed against me, her breath catching, her body reacting to every movement. My hand moved down to her thigh, fingers grazing the inside, feeling the softness of her skin beneath the fabric. Her breath hitched as my hand moved higher, and she gripped my shoulder, her body melting against me, her eyes half closed as a soft, knowing smile played on her lips. She leaned back, just enough to look at me, her fingers brushing down my jaw. "Think you can handle this, counselor?" she whispered, her voice low, teasing. I grinned, leaning in until my lips were just a breath away from hers. "I've handled tougher cases," I replied, feeling her pulse quicken under my touch. The more we saw each other, the more intense our moments became, each one feeling like an escalation, a test of just how far we were willing to go. We'd meet in obscure places, that cafe on Melrose where no one knew us, or a late-night diner out by the pier where we could sit in the back and let the world fade away. With Kate, it was as if we'd both agreed to live only in the now, leaving everything else behind. We never talked about our other lives, never even used last names. She was just Kate. I was just Ben. And in our secret world, we could be whoever we wanted. But as thrilling as it was, there was a weight beneath it all, something unspoken that grew heavier with each meeting. I could feel it in those brief pauses, in the way she'd pull back sometimes and look at me with that guarded expression, as if she was holding back something she couldn't quite let go of. For now, though, I told myself that those shadows didn't matter. All that mattered was the fire between us, the escape she gave me, the thrill of a secret that belonged only to us. Part 3, The New Client. The morning was supposed to be like any other. I'd just settled in at my desk, ready to tackle a mountain of briefs, when my assistant, Tanya, knocked on the door. "Ben," she said, glancing at her clipboard, "you've got someone here asking for you, Mr. William Grant." I didn't need a reminder of who he was. William Grant was one of the city's biggest developers, a man who knew how to get his way in any deal, whether it was commercial property or personal connections. The rumors about his business tactics were as sharp-edged as the reputation that preceded him. "All right, Tanya." "Show him in," I replied, straightening my desk, feeling a faint sense of curiosity. A few seconds later, Grant strode in, a powerful figure with an aura of someone who's used to everyone clearing a path for him. He looked around my office with the air of a man evaluating a potential investment, his blue eyes sharp behind his steel-rimmed glasses. He took a seat in front of my desk and gave me a curt nod. "Mr. Marshall," he began without preamble, "I'll get straight to the point. I need someone discreet. And I hear you're the man for that." I nodded, leaning forward, careful to keep my own expression blank. "I can certainly help. What exactly do you need discretion for?" Grant gave a long, heavy sigh, looking down at his hands before he continued. "I have a suspicion that my wife is distracted, you could say. I can't be sure, but I know when something isn't right." He paused, his voice hardening as he continued. "I need to know if I'm being made a fool of, and if so, I don't want her walking away with half of everything I've worked for." "Understood," I replied, my voice professional, detached. "I'll do my best to find the information you need while ensuring the utmost confidentiality." Grant gave a brisk nod, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small photo. He set it down on my desk, his jaw tense. "This is her. So you know what you're working with." I reached for the photo, expecting the usual society wife image, all elegance and polished smiles. But as soon as I looked down, my heart practically stopped. Staring up at me from the glossy photograph was Kate. My Kate, the woman I'd been secretly meeting for weeks, with that same amused glint in her eyes, the same soft smile. My mind scrambled, struggling to keep up with the shock of recognition. I somehow managed to keep my expression steady, my fingers frozen on the edge of the photo. After a moment, I slid it back toward him with a nod. "Understood, Mr. Grant. I'll start gathering what I can." Grant studied me, as though trying to gauge if I'd flinched. But after a moment, he nodded and rose from his chair. "Good. I'll expect updates soon, and remember, not a word of this to anyone." I stood to shake his hand, the usual routine feeling robotic as my mind raced. As soon as he left, I shut the door and leaned against my desk, trying to process what had just happened. The woman I'd been meeting in secret, the woman who'd sent my world spinning, was married to the man who'd just hired me. It felt like I was trapped in the plot of a bad movie, one I wanted out of immediately. After Grant left, I locked my office door and sank into my chair, the photo still haunting me. She was someone else entirely, living a life I hadn't even imagined. The thrill of our secret world suddenly felt dangerous, tainted by the knowledge that I'd walked into a trap of my own making. This could end everything. My reputation, my career, all of it. For the rest of the day, I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to her, to every moment we'd spent together, every laugh, every kiss. How had she managed to keep something so monumental hidden? And how could I have been so blind? There was no question about it. I had to confront her. We'd made a pact to keep things surface level, no real names, no real details. But this went way beyond anything I'd expected. Late that evening, I called her. "Ben," she answered, her voice warm, as if this was just another casual check-in. "Didn't expect to hear from you tonight." "We need to talk," I said, my tone firmer than usual. "Can you meet me at the Golden Goose?" She hesitated for a moment, sensing something was off. "All right. I'll be there in an hour." The Golden Goose was a quiet lounge downtown where no one paid attention to strangers sitting together. I'd chosen it on purpose, hoping we could speak without interruptions. Kate arrived, her face calm but her eyes scanning mine the second she sat down across from me. "All right, Ben," she said, crossing her arms. "What's going on? Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, leaning forward, my voice barely above a whisper. "About Grant. About who you really are." She didn't flinch, didn't even look surprised. Instead, she sighed, tapping her fingers on the table. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out." "Wondering when I'd figure it out?" I repeated, incredulous. "You knew your husband was coming to me?" She met my gaze with a quiet intensity. "Not exactly. But I knew he was suspicious. Victor's not the type to let anything slip by. And you, well, you were a risk I was willing to take." "A risk?" I asked, my jaw clenched. "Kate, he hired me to gather proof of your affair. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what he could do with that?" She gave a humorless laugh. "Oh, I know exactly what he's capable of. I've lived with it for years. But don't make this into something bigger than it is, Ben. We're two people who found something that made us feel alive again. That's all this was." I shook my head, trying to wrap my mind around her casual tone, the way she was brushing off the gravity of the situation. "But this isn't just about us, Kate. This is my life, my career. If he finds out—" "Then don't let him," she interrupted, her gaze steady. "He doesn't have to know. No one does." I leaned back, feeling a strange mix of anger and disbelief. "And what exactly is your plan here, Kate? To keep meeting like nothing's wrong until he figures it out?" She gave me a sad smile, her eyes softer than I'd ever seen them. "I don't know, Ben. I was hoping you'd have a solution." For a moment, we just sat there, the weight of her words settling between us. This wasn't the carefree woman I'd met in that jazz club weeks ago. This was someone else entirely, someone who was as trapped as I was, but with far less to lose. I rubbed my temples, trying to stave off the storm brewing in my mind. "We're running out of options, Kate. He wants updates, proof. If I don't give him something, he'll start digging deeper." She looked down, silent, as if weighing a decision. Finally, she looked back up at me, her voice barely a whisper. "Then maybe it's time we stop hiding." Part 4, The Threat. The next morning, I was nursing a strong coffee, trying to shake off the weight of the night before. Kate had decided to move forward with filing for divorce, and we knew there was no turning back. I knew Victor wouldn't take it well, but I hadn't expected what came next. Around 10 a.m., Tanya, my assistant, buzzed me. "Mr. Grant is here to see you, Ben." My stomach dropped. "All right, send him in." Victor walked into my office with that same air of confidence he always carried, but there was something different about him today, an intensity one hadn't seen before. He shut the door behind him and took a seat, crossing his arms as he gave me a long, appraising look. "So, Ben," he said, his voice calm and almost casual, "how's my case coming along? Any updates on my wife's distraction?" I swallowed, keeping my expression neutral. "It's progressing. These things take time." He let out a humorless laugh. "Time? Well, maybe I've saved you the trouble." I took matters into my own hands. A cold wave of dread washed over me as I forced myself to hold his gaze. "What do you mean?" Victor leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving mine. "I hired a private investigator. Thought it'd be wise to do a little digging myself. And let me tell you, Ben, I found more than enough." Before I could respond, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small manila envelope. He tossed it onto my desk, his face twisting with a cruel smile. "Go ahead. Take a look." I hesitated, but I opened the envelope, and there they were, photos of me and Kate. A lunch meeting where she'd reached across the table to touch my hand, a late-night encounter outside her building, a lingering kiss in the shadow of a quiet alleyway. Every secret, every stolen moment, captured and catalogued in a way that felt like an invasion of everything we'd tried to protect. Victor watched me, his smile never faltering. "You really thought you'd get away with it, didn't you?" he said quietly. "You and Kate. Carrying on behind my back like I wouldn't find out." I forced myself to stay calm, to not let him see the fear simmering beneath the surface. "Victor, this doesn't have to get ugly. Kate wants a divorce. You both move on, clean break. There's no need to make this worse than it already is." "Oh, you don't get it, do you?" he replied, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "This isn't just about a divorce, Ben. You humiliated me. Both of you. And now, you're going to pay for it." "Victor," I began, keeping my voice as steady as I could, "threats aren't going to get you anywhere." He laughed, a dark, bitter sound. "A threat? No, Ben. This isn't a threat. This is a promise." He leaned forward, his eyes cold and unyielding. "You and Kate? You think you're walking away from this? I'll make sure neither of you have a life to go back to." I felt a chill settle over me, but I forced myself to keep my tone controlled. "Victor, let's be reasonable. You're angry, I get it. But if you go public with this, it'll turn into a scandal for everyone involved. Is that really what you want?" He gave me a slow, mocking smile. "Oh, I don't think you understand, Ben. I'm not concerned about a scandal. I'm concerned about showing everyone exactly what happens when someone crosses me." He gestured toward the photos, his expression hardening. "I'll ruin you. Your career, your reputation, everything. And as for Kate? She'll wish she'd never left." He stood up, adjusting his jacket, as if the conversation had been nothing more than a casual chat. "You have no idea what's coming for you," he said quietly, his voice almost amused. "You and Kate, you're both done. Consider this a final warning." Without another word, he turned and left, leaving the photos scattered across my desk like evidence from a crime scene. Part 5, Victor's Revenge. Victor wasted no time. Within days, it was like he'd pulled every string, leveraged every connection, and dug his claws into every weak spot in both our lives. It started with me. I walked into my office one morning to find a letter on my desk, a formal notice that a disciplinary hearing had been called regarding my conduct, specifically citing allegations of unprofessional behavior and moral misconduct. It didn't take long to piece together the source. Victor had submitted everything, photos, statements, and an accusation that I'd intentionally interfered in a client's marriage for personal gain. The board wanted an explanation. Tanya, my assistant, looked at me with a mix of pity and horror as she quietly handed over my schedule. Word had already started to spread, and each glance from my colleagues felt like a knife to the gut. Every case I'd worked on, every success, it was all unraveling because of one man's vengeance. As I prepared for the hearing, more fallout began to pile up. Several clients withdrew their cases, claiming ethical concerns. Phone calls went unanswered, and suddenly, contracts that were once rock solid were being torn up. It was as if Victor's reach extended everywhere, and the more I tried to push back, the more I felt myself sinking. Each call I made, every appeal, led to a dead end. And then, there was Kate. Kate tried to stay strong, but Victor's attack on her was relentless. He froze their shared bank accounts, cut off her credit cards, and sent letters from his attorney demanding she vacate their home immediately. With every step she took to regain some control, he was there to push her back down. He filed a suit claiming adultery, attaching every photo, every piece of evidence, and demanding that she leave their marriage with nothing. Kate called me one night, her voice shaking. "Ben, I have nowhere to go. I tried to find a place, just something to get by for now, but every landlord I spoke to turned me away. And my accounts, they're all frozen." I clenched my jaw, feeling the full weight of Victor's power, the precision with which he was dismantling our lives. "Stay with me, Kate. We'll figure this out." But it wasn't just about finances. Victor went further. He took out a full-page ad in a local newspaper, detailing the scandalous affair between his wife and her attorney, plastering our photos in black and white under a headline that read, "The Truth Behind the Lies." The article was merciless, painting us as reckless and deceitful, weaving a story that painted him as the victim of our betrayal. The scandal went viral. People whispered when I walked by, friends stopped answering my calls, and family members avoided me. Everywhere I looked, my name and Kate's were tied to headlines that grew uglier by the day. The legal community I'd been a part of for years had turned its back on me, and even my license was hanging by a thread. For Kate, the backlash was even worse. She became a pariah overnight. Friends she'd known for years stopped answering her calls, her family turned on her, and her own parents, ashamed and humiliated, told her she'd made her bed and now had to lie in it. She had nowhere to turn. One night, I found her on my doorstep, drenched from the rain, looking hollow and defeated. "Ben," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know what to do anymore." I pulled her inside, holding her close, feeling the weight of everything we'd lost. "We'll get through this, Kate," I murmured, though even I wasn't sure I believed it. As the days passed, Victor's influence crept further, infecting every part of our lives. I lost my license, my firm dissolved my partnership, and the few remaining clients I had moved on, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. I was left with nothing but the shell of a career I'd spent years building. Kate tried to find work, but every attempt was blocked. Victor had seen to that. She couldn't find an apartment, couldn't get a job, and couldn't even make a bank withdrawal without running into a wall. He'd stripped her of everything she'd once relied on, leaving her with nothing but a tarnished name and a dwindling hope. One night, as we sat together in the quiet of my empty apartment, I looked at her, the woman I'd risked everything for, and felt a pang of guilt. "I should have known," I said quietly, my voice filled with regret. "I should have known he'd stop at nothing." She shook her head, her eyes filled with a sad resignation. "No, Ben. This was my decision. I wanted out, and he's making sure I pay the price for that." We sat there in silence, both of us exhausted, both of us knowing that there was nothing left to fight with. In the end, Victor got exactly what he wanted. He destroyed our reputations, taken everything we'd had, and left us with nothing but each other. For him, it wasn't enough to win, he had to make sure we both understood the cost of crossing him. And as the weeks turned into months, as Kate and I tried to rebuild, one truth became painfully clear: Victor Grant had won. and the life we'd once dreamed of together had turned into a shadow of something that had never really existed. He'd left us with a hollow version of ourselves, a life with no future, and a warning neither of us would ever forget.
Subscribe to never miss a new story and discover even more captivating tales.